Picture this, one man so powerful that he could single-handedly stop a nationwide financial panic just by showing up to his office. A man who owned more art than most museums, collected entire European castles, and literally saved the United States government from bankruptcy. Meet J.P. Morgan, a name that still sends shivers down Wall Street's spine more than a century after his death. You think today's billionaires are powerful? Morgan was playing a different game entirely. He didn't just have money, he was money. When banks failed, presidents called him. When the economy crashed, the entire nation looked to him for salvation. This is the story of the most ruthlessly brilliant financial mind America has ever seen. A man whose greed built an empire so vast that the government had to create new laws just to contain his power. Today, we're diving deep into the shocking world of J.P. Morgan. The man who turned banking from a simple business into an art form of absolute control. Let's start with something that will blow your mind about Morgan's level of greed and power. In 1907, America faced one of its worst financial panics in history. Banks were collapsing left and right. People were losing their life savings. The stock market was in free fall. And where was the government? Completely helpless. So who did they turn to? A single private citizen named J.P. Morgan. Morgan basically locked himself in his Manhattan mansion with other top financiers. He refused to let anyone leave until they figured out a solution. Think about that for a second. One man had more power to save the American economy than the entire federal government. That's not just wealth, that's absolute financial domination. But here's where it gets really interesting. Morgan didn't save the economy out of the goodness of his heart. He used the crisis to buy up failing companies at rock-bottom prices. While families were losing everything, Morgan was shopping for bargains. He acquired Tennessee Coal and Iron Company for a fraction of its value during this panic. This move eliminated a major competitor to his other steel interests. Pure calculated greed disguised as heroism. Now let's talk about how Morgan actually built this empire of greed. His father was already a successful banker, so Morgan didn't exactly start from nothing. But what he did with his head start was absolutely ruthless. Morgan pioneered something called Morganization. This was basically his method of taking over entire industries. Here's how it worked. First, he would identify an industry with too much competition. Then he would convince the major players that competition was wasteful. Next, he would merge all these companies under his control. Finally, he would cut costs, fire workers, and jack up prices. The result? Massive profits for Morgan and higher prices for everyone else. He did this with railroads first. In the 1880s, America had dozens of competing railroad companies. Morgan saw this as an opportunity. He systematically bought up railroad after railroad. Soon, he controlled more than 5,000 miles of railway. That's like controlling the entire transportation network of several states. But railroads were just the beginning. Morgan set his sights on something much bigger, steel. He convinced Andrew Carnegie to sell his steel company. The price? $480 million. In 1901, that was more money than most countries had in their entire treasury. But Morgan wasn't done. He merged Carnegie's company with several others to create U.S. Steel. This became the world's first billion-dollar corporation. U.S. Steel controlled 67% of all steel production in America. Imagine if one person today controlled 2/3 of all the oil, or all the internet, or all the food production. That's the level of monopolistic power Morgan wielded. And he did it all perfectly legally. Now let's talk about Morgan's personal greed and lifestyle. This man didn't just accumulate money, he flaunted it in the most outrageous ways possible. Morgan owned not one, but multiple massive yachts. His favorite was called Corsair III. This thing was basically a floating palace. It was 343 feet long with a crew of 85 people. To put that in perspective, that's longer than a football field. The yearly maintenance cost alone could have fed thousands of families. But Morgan used it maybe a few weeks per year. He also had an obsession with collecting art and rare books. Morgan spent millions buying entire private collections from European aristocrats. He would literally buy everything: paintings, sculptures, manuscripts, jewelry. His New York mansion looked more like a museum than a home. When he died, his art collection was worth more than most banks. Here's something that shows just how greedy and controlling Morgan was. He once said, "I don't want a lawyer to tell me what I cannot do. I hire him to tell me how to do what I want to do." That quote reveals everything about his mindset. Morgan didn't see laws as limits, he saw them as puzzles to solve. He would find loopholes, exploit weaknesses, and bend rules until they served his purposes. This attitude led to some of the most controversial deals in American business history. Take the formation of General Electric, for example. Morgan merged Edison General Electric with a competitor to create GE. But here's the kicker, he pushed Thomas Edison completely out of the company. The man who invented the light bulb was kicked out of his own electric company. Why? Because Edison wasn't greedy enough for Morgan's taste. Edison cared about innovation and improving people's lives. Morgan only cared about profits and market control. Let's talk about Morgan's relationship with the government. Most people think the government controls big business. In Morgan's era, it was completely the opposite. Morgan and a few other super wealthy men basically controlled the government. They decided which policies got passed and which politicians got elected. Morgan would regularly meet with presidents to discuss national economic policy. Not as an advisor, as an equal partner. Sometimes Morgan's interests conflicted with what was best for the country. And guess whose interests usually won? During the Spanish-American War, Morgan made massive profits selling bonds to fund the military. He also invested heavily in companies that manufactured weapons and supplies for the war. So Morgan was literally profiting from American soldiers going to war. This created a conflict of interest that would be considered completely unethical today. But back then, it was just business as usual for Morgan. Here's one of the most shocking examples of Morgan's greed. In 1895, the United States government was running out of gold. Without gold, the government couldn't back its currency. This could have led to complete economic collapse. President Grover Cleveland was desperate for help. So he turned to Morgan. Morgan agreed to supply the government with gold. But his price was outrageous. He demanded to buy government bonds at such a low price that he would make $7 million in profit immediately. That's like making $200 million profit in today's money. For a single transaction. With his own government. During a national crisis. The government had no choice but to accept. Morgan literally held the entire country hostage for profit. Now let's discuss how Morgan's greed affected ordinary Americans. While Morgan was getting richer, working conditions in his companies were getting worse. His factories were dangerous, poorly ventilated, and overcrowded. Workers often labored 12-hour days, 6 days a week. Child labor was common in Morgan-controlled industries. When workers tried to form unions, Morgan's companies would fire them immediately. Morgan believed that paying workers decent wages was a waste of money. He preferred to spend millions on art collections rather than improve working conditions. This attitude created massive inequality in American society. While Morgan lived like a king, his workers could barely afford basic necessities. The wealth gap during Morgan's era was even wider than it is today. Think about how that's even possible. Morgan's influence extended far beyond American borders. He had major financial interests in Europe, Asia, and South America. Morgan would often manipulate international currency markets for profit. He could cause economic problems in other countries just to create investment opportunities for himself. This kind of economic imperialism made Morgan incredibly unpopular overseas. But he didn't care about popularity, only profits. One of Morgan's most controversial international deals involved railroad construction in China. Morgan loaned money to the Chinese government at extremely high interest rates. When China struggled to repay the loans, Morgan demanded control of Chinese railway systems. This gave him massive influence over China's transportation and economy. Morgan was essentially colonizing other countries through debt. As Morgan's power grew, so did public anger against him. Newspapers started calling him an economic dictator. Political cartoons showed him as a giant octopus with tentacles strangling the American economy. The public was finally waking up to how much control one man had over their lives. This led to increased calls for government regulation of big business. President Theodore Roosevelt became famous for trust-busting, breaking up monopolies. Morgan fought these efforts every step of the way. He spent millions on lawyers and lobbyists to protect his empire. But the writing was on the wall. Morgan's era of unchecked greed was coming to an end. In 1912, Morgan was called to testify before Congress about his business practices. The hearing was supposed to expose the extent of his financial control. But Morgan was too smart and too well prepared. He gave vague answers and claimed to have poor memory about key details. When asked about his monopolistic practices, Morgan famously said, "I have done my best to serve the country." The audacity of that statement is incredible. Morgan genuinely believed that enriching himself was the same as serving America. This hearing led to major financial reforms, including the creation of the Federal Reserve System. Ironically, these reforms were designed to prevent anyone from ever again having Morgan's level of financial power. But here's the thing that makes Morgan's story so relevant today. Many of his tactics are still being used by modern billionaires and corporations. The basic playbook of monopolization, government influence, and wealth concentration hasn't changed much. The main difference is that today's ultra-wealthy are more subtle about it. Morgan's legacy lives on in the banking giant J.P. Morgan Chase. This bank is still one of the most powerful financial institutions in the world. It's a reminder that Morgan's influence didn't die with him in 1913. His methods and mindset continue to shape American capitalism today. So there you have it, the incredible story of J.P. Morgan, a man whose greed literally shaped the American economy. From saving the country during financial panics to building monopolies that controlled entire industries. Morgan showed us what happens when one person accumulates too much economic power. His story is both fascinating and terrifying. Fascinating because of the sheer audacity of what he accomplished. Terrifying because of how much control he had over millions of people's lives. The next time you hear about wealth inequality or corporate monopolies, remember J.P. Morgan. He wrote the playbook that's still being used today. What do you think about Morgan's legacy? Was he a brilliant businessman who helped build America's economy? Or was he a greedy monopolist who exploited the system for personal gain? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story as mind-blowing as I did, smash that like button. And make sure to subscribe for more incredible stories about the people who shaped our world. Trust me, you won't want to miss what we're covering next. Until then, keep questioning the stories behind the money.